Hey Greg, how are you today?
I am doing really well, Tom.
Awesome. So this season we're going to be talking about religious meta-narratives. Bit of a big word.
It is, yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
okay, I want to define it for you. I want to define it for everyone. Okay, here's a standard definition of a meta-narrative. So it is an overarching account or interpretation of events and circumstances that provides a pattern or a structure for people's beliefs and gives meaning to their experiences. So we're talking here about the accounts or the stories that are in religion and that people find meaning from through the way they've been interpreted. So we want to talk about all these stories in this season, religious meta-narratives.
Oh, I love that term. So I'm going to just, for my benefit, tell me about a religious meta-narrative versus a worldview. And I'm pretty sure I'm understanding it, but explain to me how you understand the differences.
Okay. Of course, that's a good question. We are all about context and conversation. So, I think a worldview is what you form from a religious meta-narrative. So, a worldview will contain a religious meta-narrative within. So one probably makes the other.
So it's the overarching understanding of how we are in existence in this universe, where we are in existence to one another. There's a lot of, it covers a huge amount.
Yeah. Like, we're talking about religious meta-narratives here. And take Christianity, for example. Christianity as a worldview is built or formed by a number of religious meta-narratives, and the biggest one of all, of course, is Jesus, the Messiah, and his story. And that meta-narrative of who he is and what he means to humanity then forms a worldview of what Christianity is. At least I think so.
I like the direction you're pointing us. One of the things that as I have considered this concept, and there's a question that comes to my mind, and I'm interested in hearing you think about this and talk about this. When we step back from maybe even the creation story, do we understand the universe to be a life positive universe, or a life indifference, a life quote negative universe? In essence, is the universe conspiring for your good or conspiring for your demise or indifference?
I do think that question has been asked for ages and centuries past. Is the universe a safe place?
Yes.
And how people in the past have tried to address that question. Of course, it takes us back to what we're talking about this episode, stories. So people will tell stories to try and explain a lot of things. Or maybe let me throw a question at you, Greg.
Yeah.
Why do we tell stories?
Oh, great question. And I think that is fundamental to a human being, because as a human being, we are in relationship with other people. We are in relationship to the planet, and we are in relationship to nature. And it is by these stories do we find meaning. It is by these stories we find identity. And it is by these stories we often find a determination. It is a very powerful motivating component in the psyche of humanity.
Greg, we're talking about these meta-narratives, the creation. Like I said, the first place to begin is at the beginning. So the Genesis narrative now, can you summarize that for us?
Sure.
Okay, go for it.
So the Genesis story has God creating matter. You got day and night, so you have light and darkness. Then you have...
You had to throw that in there.
I did.
Okay,
I did.
all right,
I had to throw that in there. Then, of course, you actually have matter, the land as we call it. Day 3 is where you actually have the creation of life for the first time we see it. This is when the fauna and the flora is produced. So we have the covering of the earth on it. Then you have the creation of the animals, and we have that. And then ultimately, on day 6, you have the creation of mankind. And so that is the creation story in a summary. What is taking place. And one other component to it is we're seeing this in a time frame of a 24-hour time frame.
That's an interesting Jewish nuance that's in that story. But I also think it is worthwhile pointing out that right there, the other Genesis creation narrative, the male human being is created first, and then the female later from a part of his side. That is the Hebrew narrative says. But in the first narrative, they are created at the same time. Now, theologians will play around with those two stories and say, well, one explains the other. But for our argument here, our conversation, these are two stories telling two different events. So, okay, what happens to this perfect world that's been created? Now, summarize that part for us.
Yeah, so they're in this lovely garden.
Yeah.
They're taking care of the trees, taking care of the gardens. They have done their job at naming animals, and we see that taking place and essentially on the second creation story about the naming. So that part is done. And then in that garden, there is a place, we're going to call it trees, that they have a choice to make, and they make a very poor choice. And at that point in time, things unravel for them.
Okay, so things go bad after a bad decision is made. And hence, I guess, this is how they choose to introduce the question of human suffering. Okay, so human beings suffer because of
poor choices.
Poor choice.
Yeah.
So we as human beings are suffering the consequences of poor choices that our great, how many ever greats you want to throw in there, fathers and mothers did. Okay. There's a flood narrative somewhere there in the Genesis narrative. Okay, go for it. Summarize that part.
So what we read in Genesis is that after a time frame, we don't know the time frame, but there's obviously more people on the planet at this point in time. Things get bad, and God instructs Noah to produce or manufacture an ark. And this is this large boat, and ultimately animals arrive, and Noah and his family get on this ark, and a flood comes, and of course, as the Genesis story shows, is that only Noah and his family are saved.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the animals that are with him on the ark, everyone else is gone.
Yeah, and then again, in that portion of the story, there is that, I guess what we call it, this play of numbers,
Yeah.
You were doing the 24-hour cycles there. The animals, I think, come some in twos, some in groups of 7,
Yep.
and so on. And then an angel closes the door of the ark at some point, and it rains. And life outside of the ark is destroyed. Greg, how does God respond? I mean, what happens? What's the conversation that happens in the Genesis narrative between God and Noah after that? Does God regret? What happens after that?
So, yes, in the Genesis story, ultimately the waters recede. The ark ends up on dry land. The ark door is opened up, and then Noah and his family get out, and ultimately at some point in time they have a sacrifice, and God produces this rainbow in the sky that is a demonstration. It's a gift saying that I won't destroy the world with water ever again.
Okay, so God says, no more.
Exactly.
No more. I'm not going to do this again.
Not with water.
Good point. Yeah, not with water. He does say not with water. So here are the two other creation narratives. Okay, and I want you to pay attention to these narratives. Okay, we're just going to walk through them, and the director behind all the cameras here is going to put this story on the screen, and then that way we get all the beautiful portions of it as correct as we can. But people can obviously go online and read these stories for themselves. Yeah. So the first story that's identical to the Genesis narrative, and maybe I shouldn't say that because we end up getting into the whole conversation which story came first. Okay, so this is a Mesopotamian epic of Atrahasis. Okay, so in this story, the lesser, the Igigi or Igigi, whichever way you want to pronounce that, the Igigi gods were burdened with too much work imposed on them by the 7 great gods. So you have the great gods and they impose work on the lower gods. So here is the work. The Gigi had to dig out canals. They had to clear channels.
It's a lot of heavy lifting.
It's heavy lifting. It's creation. They had to dig out the Euphrates.
It's a big job.
That is a big job. Okay, and then the work, as you can see, was long and extremely hard. So they did the next logical thing when you're given work that is long and hard. They rebelled. And so before, and I'm summarizing the story here, before the great rebellion between the gods, a peaceful resolution was agreed upon. And here is a great plan that the gods came up with. Okay, we're not going to fight each other. We're going to make human beings. The humans will do all the heavy lifting. It is the human beings who are going to do all this hard work, and we, the gods, can live in harmony.
Brilliant idea.
Fantastic idea. Okay, so, and then there's a portion of a story where they had to slaughter one of the gods, mixed his flesh with blood and with clay to make human beings. I think it's quite familiar to the Genesis narrative where the gods, correct me if I'm wrong, they make human beings from the dust of the ground or something like that. I mean, if I remember very well, the very name Adam in the Hebrew narrative is a reference to the tone or texture of the ground that he was made from. It's a reddish, clayish kind of. Anyway, conversation for another day. You and I love conversations.
So this first man was kind of a reddish, clay-colored guy.
Greg, you are trying to push me into this conversation, and you might just do a good job of it, but no, I refuse today. No.
Okay.
I guess
We'll do it.
that's the nuance of that story, and maybe in another time we need to talk about the nuance of those names and colors, because I think in the first creation story in the the Genesis narrative, and I think the Creator God names both the male and female human beings Adam. And the term Eve comes later as some sort of affectionate term that the male Adam gives to the female Adam, and it's part of the beauty of how they tell that entire story. But I am going back to these stories, okay? And don't tempt me again. Okay, so now they sacrifice this god. I think his name is Awilu. Might be butchering that pronunciation. And they take his blood and his flesh and they make human beings so that the gods don't have to go to war. So over time, human beings increased, like you said in the Genesis narrative. Now there are lots of people in the world. In this narrative, over time, human beings increase and their noise is extremely intolerable to the gods. The gods then collectively decide to destroy them with a flood. Now, this is where this story gets interesting. This is a story where this is how Atrahasis comes into this story. One of the gods, I think his name is Enki, Enki, thinks it's a pretty bad idea to destroy people. So he visits Atrahasis. I think in the Genesis narrative, God tells Noah to build an ark.
Yes.
In this narrative, Enki tells Atrahasis to build an ark and save his family and several animals. Now, of course, the other gods are unhappy with Enki. Why did you warn him? And so on and so on. But as you know, the story goes, the flood happens, people are killed, animals are killed, and after the flood, the gods look at the devastation and they say, oh my goodness, I felt like saying that. Oh my God, what have we done? What have we done? Who is going to feed us? Who's going to sing our praises? Who's going to celebrate us? Who's going to do all this? And then the guy who was blamed for all of this, for warning Atrahasis, now becomes the hero. Enki is now the hero. You've saved us, and then the gods give Atrahasis, this gift of planting and so on, and the whole world goes back to where it was, and the gods promise to never destroy human beings with water again. And one of the promises they make, it's quite an interesting thing they do here. So to control the noise of human beings, they decide that they are going to control their numbers. And to do that, they then give, birth pains and all of these things to discourage. Okay, hey, that's the story. Now there's a second story, a bit shorter. It's called the Enuma Elish. This story, interestingly, was found in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library. Mr. Director, please put that on the screen. It's quite a fascinating stuff that they found there, archaeologists. So here's a summary, Reader's Digest version of the story. Okay, so in the beginning, before heaven and earth were named and before all of this was done, the gods came into existence in the midst of swelling waters. Genesis narrative, there was water, and okay, leave that. Now, two of the gods who came up from that swelling of waters, fresh water, was a god named Apsu, Apsu. He came into existence. and Tiamat, Tiamat. They both come into existence, and they then bring into existence several other younger gods.
Oh, good of them.
Okay. Fantastic idea they thought of. So we have several other younger gods, and of course they are noisy.
Oh no.
And this just absolutely frustrates them. They can't stand them. You know, you're trying to get your quiet time, and these gods are just noisy. So they come up with this idea. It's Apsu who came up with this idea. He says, honey, I have an idea. Let's kill them.
Oh, not this again.
So Apsu and Tiamat, they decide, yeah, you know what? We'll just take them out of the picture. We're going to kill them. And somehow the younger gods hear of this, and under the leadership of Marduk, Marduk, the god Marduk, the younger gods come together and they decide to fight against these older creator gods. And there's this great battle of the gods, and it was messy, it was nasty. And then at the end of that battle, like many battles that we have seen, there is a conversation. Okay, why did we do this? What went wrong?
Oh, whoops.
Yeah, you know, and at the end of that conversation, they come up with a solution. Okay, we know who to blame. It's this other god. They find the conspirator. They kill him. They take his blood, and they create human beings whose job would be to proclaim the praises of the gods. And then the story goes on and on and on and on. So 2 stories, Greg.
Yep.
Similar to the Genesis narrative. What are your thoughts?
You know, that's really intriguing 2 stories. One of the thoughts that occurred to me is when I was articulating the summary of the Genesis story, and you asked me regarding the flood. One of the things that we see in Genesis where Noah was inviting people to come on the ark with him. And that's really an interesting component of it. It wasn't just exclusively for him and his family. It was open to anybody that wanted to join them. You didn't have to pay to get on. You just jump in. So that's an interesting point, because in the stories that you're sharing here is that these are people that are in trouble.
Yeah.
For what they're doing, and they're except one is a warning that, hey, this is, you got to build an ark. Both of them got to get the ark going on it. It has a lot of correlation to what we see in the world today, that we're invited to jump in on an ark, and you can extrapolate some interesting things on that.
Yeah.
So I like I like all 3 of these stories, and the interesting thing that you just pointed out, there is a lot that is comparable, all 3 of them.
Yeah.
And that actually speaks to the validity of this story. It gives credence to the fact that not only the Jewish, even though this was not a Jewish story per se, it is a Jewish narrative of Genesis. We have these other 2 stories that have so much similarity. It gives credibility to all 3 of them.
Yeah.
It adds value to the fact that this is something that was understood. This is something that was appreciated. This was their religious meta-narrative that they subscribed to, and their worldview was based on that.
Yeah, so like we said in the beginning, we tell stories to answer the big questions of life and to draw cultural boundaries and to do all these things. And you're pointing out that this, what we are calling the Jewish creation narrative, when in actual sense, we're all about nuance here. Let's throw in the nuance. it is the Jews who promote this narrative with their contextualization. But the narrative comes from a deeper well of creation stories, and they took from that well one of these stories, and they contextualized it to their experience. Now, I guess, Greg, what do you do with stories that are seemingly conflicting? Like, first of all, we just saw that in the Genesis narrative, you have two stories that seem to conflict. Like you can fairly ask the question, was the male Adam created first, or were the two Adams, the male and female Adam, were they created at the same time? Like you can ask that question of those stories. In your view, what do you do with stories that seem to be conflicting?
So we have two stories. These two that you've shared with us are more similar in nature than the Genesis story. The Genesis story is the one that's more out of sync with the other two. But you've just made a really important point here. They all have a God that has been the initiator of humankind on this planet.
Yeah.
That's critical. That is foundational to my worldview. Secondly, you have an event that has somebody creating too much noise, somebody made poor choices in the garden. You have a divergence of where the story should be going, and it collapses because somebody has performed poorly, making too much noise, eating off the wrong tree or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So you have that event. That is the pivotal point in all three of these stories. So you have that point where now in the Genesis story, it resonates there also. You have, again, a flood story, albeit differently told, but you have a flood story. And I think you've just shared only two of these stories. I know, for example, many of the First Nations people have flood stories. There's many of the different cultures around the world have a lot of different cultures have these flood stories. They have a very similar component to it. And so for my worldview, my meta-narrative is, number one, there you see an act of God participating in the creation of mankind. You see an event taking place that has caused causation for God to do something dramatic. And three, you have the ark with all its nuances with it.
Yeah. So, my goodness, this is interesting. So we do need to point that out, okay? There are lots of creation narratives out there, okay? I know that in the indigenous stories, there is one of my favorite stories is the one of the woman who falls from the sky. It's a creation narrative, and she's pregnant, and she gives birth to twins. I'm probably just not doing the story justice, and those twins, it's kind of like black and white, One twin creates rivers and they are so nice and straight. The other twin makes them meander,
Oh no.
One twin makes the trees nice and straight in the forest, like you could just walk through. The other twin just messes it all up, and they're saying creation is we cooperate in creating the universe. And so, I grew up in Southern Africa, and we have creation stories like the God, the creator being in our creation stories is female. Like the indigenous one where the woman who falls from the sky. Our God is also a woman who gives birth to the nation and creates all these beautiful things. But you were pointing out the things that the stories have in common. And I think sometimes we miss out on that when we get distracted. We'd say, oh, this story is different from these stories. They're different stories. Stories change every time they are told. We call that contextualization. Stories are always contextualized in every telling, from one storyteller to the next. Stories will change, be it in what the people were wearing, but the foundational elements of the stories remain. So take the three stories we just compared here. Like you said, number one, the stories agree that the gods exist.
Yes.
That is not an argument the stories are making. The stories are saying the gods exist, period.
Yep.
The stories are also saying with one voice that human beings exist because of the gods. So human beings are, there's a fancy word I'm thinking of here and I just can't bring it to memory. Human beings are contingent beings.
Yes.
They exist because the gods exist. So the stories all agree on that. Like there's no conversation. Trying to understand these stories in the context where they were told in the ancient world.
Yeah.
The stories also agree that there was a war.
Yep. All three of them.
All three of them. It's hard to know, but there was a war. There was a war. And the stories seem to agree that the outcomes of that war seem to determine the quality of the relationship that human beings have with the gods. So what came out of that war? So we are, as human beings, the results of some sort of big cosmic, I guess, warfare that happened, and we don't have the whole picture. But our relationship with the gods is somewhat problematic. Okay, now all these stories, the stories agree that the gods decided to destroy the noisemakers. The stories also agree that the gods, two of them that we spoke about here, but more of them do, agree that the gods looked at this decision and thought, my God, what did I do? This is a bad decision. And they vow not to destroy people with water again. So the stories are also all agreeing with one accord. They are all saying, we acknowledge that there is suffering.
Yes.
They are all acknowledging it. The question is, how does that suffering come to be? The Genesis narrative says poor decisions by people. The other narratives say, you got no choice, buddy.
Yeah.
The gods put you in this predicament and you are at their mercy.
Yeah, suck it up.
Suck it up, yeah. So you have all these stories, and what we're saying here is that these stories then become a meta-narrative that you can choose to adopt. And then that narrative then shapes the boundaries of life, your understanding, and just how you carry yourself, how you view other people, how you view the gods ultimately.
Yes.
Does that make any sense?
It does, yes.
Yeah.
And this is really critical because in two of these stories, the humans are victims of gods. Poor decisions, etc., making too much noise, whatever, they are victims.
Yeah.
And if you buy into that concept, you live your life, when you have problems and difficulties, you are a victim. You live it with that worldview. I'm a victim because of the gods, or because of this, or because of that.
Yeah, I think there's a term for that. It's this victim mentality.
Yes.
I think it's worth defining. May I ask the director to just put it on the screen? I think we need to read that definition,
yes.
Greg. What is a victim mentality? I don't want to was to try and describe it here. Might as well just blame someone online, What is victim mentality? Now, victim mentality is an acquired personality that in which a person or group of people tends to recognize or consider themselves as victim of the negative actions of others.
Yes, precisely.
So that's exactly what you're talking about. You're saying there's this victim mentality that because of what was done, therefore I am what I am.
Yeah. And it goes even one step further. You and I were talking about this concept a few minutes ago. Is the universe conspiring for me or conspiring against me? And in these two stories, we see the universe conspiring against them.
Yeah.
They are victims. In the Genesis story, we see the universe conspiring for the good of the person.
Greg, talk about that. How? How?
As I just pointed out, we see the gods, they're upset with them. They're making too much noise, da-da-da-da-da. In the Genesis story, we see problems taking place. We see the people are making too much noise, so to speak. They are killing. We really don't know what they're doing, but they are being problematic to themselves. They are going to, from my understanding and study, they will probably create enough grief and anxiety and pain that they will go extinct if they kept on in what they're doing. So God intervenes and says, here, Noah, you come on board, build an ark, and invite as many people as you can to get on board with this thing. So again, he's looking out for the life of people. The question that sometimes is asked, what if a whole hundreds of thousands of people showed up and said, I want to get on the boat with you, Noah?
Yeah.
We don't know. But the point is that God is saying, look, I'm interested in preserving life. Open it up to anybody that wants to come. So now we only have Noah and his family that actually end up on that boat. The boat line, we have angels opening and shutting doors. We have them landing in a safe place. The boat and all three of them makes it through the storm. And they come out. And again, we have a God that's promising not to destroy with water ever again. So we have a God that is looking out for people. He is the one that's initiating this one. And he's the one that says, here's what you need to do to save yourself.
Yeah, so maybe let's throw in a more nuance to this. Okay, we're talking about how these stories have different kinds of contextualization that are more in line with, say, how the particular storytellers view the world around them.
Yes. So and this is an important point. On the Genesis account, they're seeing the person as a value. We want to protect them. We want to take care of them. So they are a cherished child. They're a cherished family. On the other ones, we don't see anybody cherishing them. So, by the way, you need to do this if you want to survive. Good luck.
But Greg, in the Genesis account, the God kicks them out of his fancy garden. Is that, in the Genesis account, is that a pro-people move by the gods?
So in the Genesis account, there is two choices that are given in the garden. One is a tree that has our options, and I'm going to... We're not quite sure, but there's an option for eternal life or an option for, quote, knowledge, pain, exact... Yeah, you get knowledge. You get knowledge of pain. You get knowledge of death. You get all sorts of knowledge on that one. So you have those two options. So once that Adam and Eve made the poor choice, if you let them loose in that garden, and they would ultimately have the option to go back and say, look, I'm not happy with my first choice. Let me go try this other choice and eat off the tree of life.
Yeah, I see.
Now you have a person that has taken on poor choices, and by that, from my reading and understanding, you see the human body breaking down because of poor choices. So now you have the human body breaking down poor choices, then you put an eternal component in that, and now you have an eternal sick person.
You know, I can't help but, just to say this in favor of the biblical creation narrative, that I think we're living in a world where the right to choose is of great value, and as some people will argue, has come under a lot of threat. Do I have the right to make decisions that are good for myself and they don't harm my neighbors? So hey, you see that in the Genesis. The Genesis narrative seems to affirm choice, even the poor choices. In the other stories, it's just, there's really no deep conversation about choice. I don't know, I just throw that in there because
that's a powerful point that you make. You have given people choices. You've given people options. And that implies that there's value on your ability to make a decision.
Exactly, yeah.
I put value as a God, from a God's perspective, I put value on you as my created being to make a choice. You may have made a poor one, but I still respect your choice.
Yeah, and giving someone the right to choose, and I might be wrong about this, but I feel like it's also an affirmation of their humanity and their value. You say, I value you, you can have this choice, and whatever you choose doesn't take away from how valuable you are. I mean, that works for that's a point for the Genesis creation narrative, in that, of course, as you pointed out, the human beings made a poor choice in that narrative. And then their creator came and got involved in what sounds like a very positive thing. I think he comes in there and he says, what happened? He's looking for them. He's asking questions. He's involved. In the other narratives, my goodness, there really isn't much choice, no positive involvement.
That's right.
At the end, maybe when the gods are saying, you know what, now we're not going to destroy you with water. Yeah, maybe that's positive.
But you still got to praise us, and you got to still dig our ditches and all these other things that go with it.
Yeah. Yeah, like in that one story, human beings are created to sing the praises of Marduk. And I know the scholars in this field, go in depth on what it means to sing praises. You and I, the everyday person, thinks, well, just opening our mouths and singing as loud as we can. But, there's all stuff in there. But maybe let me just throw out something a bit hard to swallow out there. I think the Genesis narrative also has some shortfalls. In my relationship with my spouse, my significant other, I do not, it will be a tragedy if how I treat her, if the way I treat her is in line with the narrative in Genesis where I have the power and the authority, she's just a helper that came out of my side, and that power dynamic there. I mean, Greg, I think that's working against the Genesis story. What do you do with that? How do you swallow that pill?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and great question, and I'm not sure if there's a good answer. I really don't know, because one is that we as quote quote men, the first created, aren't going to survive without. There's no children is going to happen if you don't have the wife.
Yeah.
So that becomes pretty critical. Most of us wouldn't survive without the wife. So,
Yeah.
So it is a interesting question, and I think that type of a question comes from the fact that you just pointed out earlier. It was the time and the place that it was told. It was
context.
The context. And so you're going back to that society, and that society was very much a male-driven society. Women, unfortunately, didn't have the rights that they do today. It was, you had two levels of humanity in that society. One had more privileges than the other, and that was the male that had the privileges. And so when the story was told, it only made sense to put it in that context.
Yeah, because that's the cultural boundary, I guess, that they have. So they will tell that story. I mean, it's intriguing. I don't know, but both stories are there in the biblical context.
Yes,
the one that brings male and female as equals, and the one that brings male then female. The one that has a power dynamic, and that is let me rephrase, the one that has an unequal power dynamic, and the other one that has an equal power dynamic. I mean, hey, the professionals out there can probably talk more on that.
But let me add this, and this is my reading and understanding. Number one is that the role of the male was primarily to protect the female. And even in the world that we live in today, I see this quite often, especially in the birds. The male will actually run interference for the female. And you see that taking place. And in my understanding is that the male primary role was to protect and run interference for the female.
Yeah, Greg, I think that's another cultural contextualization. I mean, I hear where you're coming from, but we'll disagree on this one.
Okay, we'll do that. Yeah,
we'll just disagree on this one, because I think power, and I think it's okay for us to have this conversation about power, because where power falls, where power lies, and where power is ultimately used is determined by the stories we tell. Like without mentioning names and all of that, you can easily tell a story. Now, Do you know what? I'll give the director another task here. There's a story I remember about, maybe it's a proverb or a story. Once you find it, you give me the thumbs up and we'll put it on the screen. Yeah, about an army that besieged a city, and they just could not, for the life of them, they could not tear down this city. And then one sage, wise person, went into the city and he just destroyed the city with a story. You know, like you can ultimately control power, and you can. I remember there's one philosopher who said something along the lines of, oh boy, now my memory is playing games on me. I do not care. Allow me to write the songs they listen to. I care not who writes their laws.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay? Because in songs, you have the stories.
Yeah.
You have, and these stories begin to shape the boundaries of culture and the boundaries of power. And so, I mean, I would disagree with you, my friend, because I think that entire power dynamic is a result of the stories we've told. You know, I grew up in Southern Africa, as I've mentioned, and we have a good amount of female queens. Sorry, there I go, my androcentric, yikes.
Yeah.
Queens, and they are the rulers.
Yes.
They are the ones who make the decisions. They are the ones who send people to war. They are the ones who do all of these things. So I think you grow up with that story, how you view the power dynamics changes.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's the story that has informed your worldview, you know. And so, yeah, I think we'll
leave it alone.
we'll leave it alone.
Yeah.
But as we discuss the context here, you know, I think it's important to realize that though one story works, let me rephrase. The stories will have deficiencies.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, as I said, that's a very powerful point. There's no perfect story.
There is no perfect story. Yeah. And so I think there is one story that can speak more powerfully or more directly to the human experience than others, but it doesn't mean that there's no hierarchy of stories here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The stories are all affirming a couple of things together, but which story speaks to my experience the most? Or maybe let me ask you that question, Greg. I've given you two stories plus the biblical narrative,
Sure.
and
Sure.
you and I know of many other stories, and I want everyone who's watching this to be able to tell us more stories, because we don't know all the stories.
That's right,
you know,
yeah.
we want to know the creation stories. Tell us, and when you talk about them, you know, you're sharing with everyone else who's watching this. The creation stories, you know, Greg. Which one works best for you?
Well, I like the creation story. I like all three of them. They're fun to read, and they're fun to evaluate. What I like about all three of them, and I'm going to just put that, is that this is the causation of humanity wasn't a bunch of random stuff in the universe. You actually have a very powerful being that initiates a creation event. So that part I really like. I'm a businessman. I don't go gambling, but using the gambling analogy, I don't. Let me back. I'm a man of faith. I'm a man of faith. Yes, I am. I like the creation story. I like the Christian narrative. But if we look at the whole concept of random chance, the best I have been able to understand it is that if I were to go into casino, or you were to go into casino,
my favorite place in the world.
For random chance to actually get to the first level of life, you would have to walk through the casino, and if there's 20 slot machines, you'd have to hit the jackpot on 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. All 20, you would, as you walk through, you would have to hit it. If you didn't, you have to back up and start again. And so for me, I don't have enough faith in your ability to hit jackpots.
No. I'd have tried.
And so for me, I don't have that level of faith to say, oh yes, this is a random chance. So in all three of these stories, they talk about a God initiating a creation event. So that part resonates with me.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part, Greg, because in all stories, it's affirming that behind the veil of the unknown, that be it religion or science, is trying to take a peek at the creation narratives, the ancient creation narratives are saying there's a being, there's a God. The question now I bring to you again, Greg, is of the stories, which of them for you works best in answering the issue of the relationship part?
Yes. So thank you for bringing me back to that question.
Yeah.
I like the Genesis one. Now that's just me. I like the Genesis one because number one is that as we talked about just a moment ago, I am no longer seeing myself as a victim. I am a valuable person. I'm a valuable and cherished individual. I am seeing the universe is conspiring for my good. It's helping me along the way. I can, with that narrative, I feel, I know I can turn to the gods, for help because I've seen his response in times past. I can have compassion on somebody that isn't able to meet the expectations of society. And so for me, I find, again, this is for myself, if I haven't experienced it personally, it's very hard for me to try and generate an emotion to somebody else that is not me.
Okay.
So for my end of it, my story that I hold in my head challenges me to respond positively, to respond in a kind fashion to those people that are singing poorly and making noise.
Mr. Director, Greg just brought up something interesting here, and I think you should put it on the list of things we need to talk about here. And Greg says the universe is conspiring for the good, for him, and I think that's something we really need. Probably not this time, but you put it on the list there, and we need to talk about that. This all is the universe conspiring for our good. Can we think ourselves into something? Okay, getting carried away. So, God is working. The universe is working for your good. In the other stories, the universe is the gods.
They're putting up with me.
Putting up with you.
Yes. I am an annoyance. If I don't sing too much, or if I don't
make noise,
or if I don't sing praises to him, I become of no value. And this is really interesting because many stories that I am familiar with is that I as a human being am out to try to appease, to surrender, to give, or something to get in the good graces of a God.
Yeah.
I'm always trying to do something.
Yeah, I grew up with that, in the religious, Southern African religious, meta-narrative.
Yeah.
You have to keep the gods happy or else you're in trouble. It'd be the gods or the ancestors. You just have to keep them happy. So when you're eating, you take a portion of your food and you put it on the ground for them to eat. I mean, it's a location, we think they're on the ground. But anyway, it's a topic for another day, a topic that the director won't put on the list. You put it on the ground and the gods need to be appeased constantly. And if you don't, things don't go well for you. And so you have to go back to them and say, things are not going well. What did I do wrong? I'll give you a whole list of stuff and then you have to do stuff. But I'm affirming what you're saying. I hear what you're saying.
And on the Genesis story, this is just to follow what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is that they made a poor choice. And as you just said earlier, instead of the gods throwing up their hands and walking away and say, hey, what do we see happening? He comes down and say, hey, guys, what's happening? Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about this. And he starts giving methods and mechanisms to keep them in a relationship with him.
Wow.
And that is an amazing concept because now we see a God throughout history that consistently is doing that. And in my life, I can see the same thing.
Okay. My, oh my. The elephant in the room. Human suffering.
Yes.
Which of the three stories answers that question best for you? Why do people suffer?
I would love to use the two stories that you shared.
Yeah.
Say, hey, you poor smuck. You know what? I'm sorry you're in the wrong place in the wrong spot. Life is tough. Deal with it. I'm sorry you're suffering, but, may you get over it and get on with it. The third one, the Genesis one, challenges me. It says, you know what? You have been shown, I'm going to use the word grace. You've been shown kindness. You've been shown compassion when you screwed up. Greg, you've seen that. You've experienced it. I challenge you to do something to your brother, your friend, the acquaintance, the nobody that you've never seen before, somebody in your neighborhood, somebody across the world. It challenges me to say, yeah, I have to do something. Yeah. I can't not do something. That's the problem with buying into the Genesis thing, because I have an onus, because I have received something and I see you struggling. I need to show compassion. That's in my psyche. Yeah. And that's in my worldview is that it shows me compassion. And I, in turn, I don't have to show compassion. But when I show compassion and when I do compassionate things to the person that's suffering, it aligns my relationship with my God. And by that I mean is that I can look him in the eye, so to speak, and say, I did my best.
Yeah.
I didn't solve the problem, but I did my best.
Yeah. I mean, we should appreciate, I guess, that the creation narratives of old, Genesis narrative and all the other ones that we spoke about, and the ones we didn't mention, here, the ones that everyone is going to remind us on the chat. I think the creation narratives, as far as I can think, do not run away from the issue of human suffering. Sometimes I do think it is important for us to pause and acknowledge that this is not a myth. Human beings go through suffering, be it in the case of war, broken families, and we suffer. We have times where we go through suffering, and we do want our stories to embrace that, because it is part of the human experience. I'm pretty sure there could be someone who's watching this right now who's going through some tough times, and what we want, the psychologists are telling us that when you recognize that I am suffering, don't tell me it's all in my head.
Yeah.
I want my friend to say, hey, this is tough, to acknowledge that I'm going through a bad time. And these stories, thumbs up to these stories. They all acknowledge that suffering, human suffering, is an issue that needs to be addressed.
Yep.
The Genesis narrative, I give the Genesis narrative some credit here. The Genesis narrative is, I also like that fact that the creator gets involved.
Yes. Extremely powerful.
Yeah, it's not the problem of the created, even though they made the poor decision, but the creator, the gods, get involved in a positive way. I know people say, okay, how about the flood? How positive is that? And I'll acknowledge that is a difficult question.
Yep.
That is a difficult question. And yet, there seems to be this movement towards being pro-life or pro-human in the Genesis narrative.
That's an extremely important point. I love that you brought that up, because God is life positive in the Genesis story, consistently, always bringing in life. He's the one positive. It is life positive all the way down the story. All of those two accounts, we see that, albeit some really interesting nuances, some that we don't really have great answers for. But what we do know, we have a God that says, look, life is valuable. Life is important. Life is magical.
I like that word. It is magical.
Yeah.
It is magical. There's a beauty in the complexity of life, and the God of the Genesis narrative says, I want to give it to you to experience, in all its beauty and complexity. In the other narratives, it's hard to see that. It's hard to see that. In the other narratives, take the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Atrahasis, in that narrative, the relationship between humans and the gods, there is no, what's that word you used again? Life affirming?
Life positive. Yes. Yeah.
Life positive, Mr. Director. Life positive. Please. We need to make sure that we own that word. Yeah, it's so life, that positivity towards human life.
It's valuable.
It's valuable, and you don't see it in in the other stories. You could, even after the flood, the gods only start to value human life because they are hungry and they have no one to work for them, and so then they like, oh, what did we do? So it's a bit selfish, maybe.
Yep.
But in the Genesis narrative,
That's a really interesting point, because that is so it's so easy for me to do that as a businessman. I value that person because of the productivity that he can produce. Can he do this or that or the other thing? And his skills. So he's a highly valued person because of his productivity and et cetera, et cetera. That is exactly the same stories same thing in those two stories. The productivity, can they produce this? Can they sing for us? Can they praise us? Can they do this? Those are things that are the productivity of that person.
Yeah.
And the Genesis is, hey, you're valuable because you're mine.
You're valuable just the way you are, because
exactly.
you belong.
I don't care if you messed up. I don't care if you're whatever. You're still mine and you're valuable. Because there is a life in you.
Yeah.
You are valuable.
You're valuable.
And the productivity. Oh yeah, we all like to see productivity, but your value doesn't increase or decrease on your productivity. The Genesis story speaks to that.
I like that. Your value doesn't increase or decrease because of your productivity.
Exactly.
You are valuable. That's it. Let's do something a bit difficult here. And we've been trying to do this all along. What are the positive things do we find in the other two creation narratives we spoke about? Because I think it's easy to take a slant towards what your biases make it easier
Yes.
to do.
And I will fully admit to it.
Yeah. But we have to get to that place where we recognize that, things are really not as black and white as we'd like them to be. Like, what is...
Oh, they bring much value. And I think there's tremendous value in these stories. And the one that, again, the fact that we see an example of the creation there. They're mixing the blood and the dirt, and they're making a human being.
Yeah.
It speaks to this creation event where there's a divine intervention. And that is an extremely interesting and a complex concept that they've been able to put together in a few words. Yeah, mixing blood and dirt, as wild as it might sound, it actually speaks to a divine intervention at the creation of that person.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Oh, I absolutely like that. Because what it's saying in that story is that story is finding a way to define what it means to be human. And in that definition of the two stories, outside of the Genesis narrative, because the Genesis narrative, I think it does that on its own way, in its own skill, in the other two stories, the stories are affirming that within you, there is part God or God-likeness, to borrow the language of Genesis.
Yeah.
There is God-likeness, and in you, there is also a connection to the earth you live in. So you're connected to this earth, but you're also connected with the gods. And you have that being in you. And so when you're going through life, whatever that the gods decide is going to happen to you, it doesn't strip you of the God-likeness in you and your connection to the earth, And I think that's valuable. That's something that at least the Christian interpretation of the Genesis narrative doesn't like to bring out. I'll give you an example. In the Genesis narrative, the Christian meta-narrative of it says God gave human beings, or the male human Adam, the male Adam, dominion. And so we can cut trees, we can just treat the earth poorly. because we have the authority, we have the power. In the other narrative, you just have to recognize that you're not only God, or at least part God, you also belong to this earth.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's valuable.
It is, and I think that speaks to the fact that we should be caretakers of this earth because we are made from the earth. So there's some really interesting angles, and it gives credibility to this whole idea that we are caretakers and we have a responsibility to this earth, and this is us.
Yeah. See, I heard one thinker at one point saying we are not in charge of the earth. We belong to the earth. Yeah. So we are a part of. We're not above. We are a part of. And I remember when I heard that, I sat down with it. I thought about it. And I think, she was right.
Yeah.
I am a part of the earth.
In the Genesis story, it talks about creating man from the dust of the earth. So you have that same part of the earth connection.
Yeah.
That linkage there is there both in the Genesis story and in these other two stories.
Yeah, and it's a connection. I feel like sometimes we often just in our interpretation, when we draw our boundaries on how we're going to shape our worldview and how we act and think about the world, we often choose to not emphasize that part, that we are a part of the earth. We have in us, in our very being, earthliness, and I mean the Genesis narrative says the gods say, let's create human beings in our image, So our earthliness is often not emphasized, but our godlikeness, our dominion, our power is what's usually put out, and having that in a meta-narrative without the nuance and the context brings us to the world we live in today, where we feel like we can, this is just maybe my biased view, where we feel like we can walk into any place and cut down any tree we want, and just fish all the fish we can out of the the lakes and the oceans, just abuse this world, not realizing that, no, we're not above, we are a part of.
There's something to be said for the Genesis story that actually speaks to that too, is that as I remember reading it, God invited them to till the earth and to grow product out of it.
Yeah.
That's actually really an intriguing idea of engaging the person in the production of fruit and vegetables, food, whatever it is. Stuff.
Yeah.
Better put it stuff.
Yeah.
And if we take that same approach to not only producing food stuff, we could take the same approach to farming our forests. We can take that same approach to farming the resources that we have out of the oceans or the lakes, etc. So if we take a farming approach, as pointed out in Genesis, it's not a zero-sum game where I'm here first, I take everything.
Greg, I've never really thought about that. That's a nuance you're throwing into this narrative that I've really never paid much attention to. And I think this is why these conversations are important, because you're correct. In the Genesis narrative, they are given the opportunity to work the earth they belong to.
Yeah, exactly.
They are working the earth they belong to. So, in other words,
and from.
Yeah. They belong to and from. So they are working themselves in a strange way. And I've really never thought about it that way. And it just brings a twist. See, this is how important creation narratives are. See, if I have that narrative now and I use that narrative to shape my boundaries, then when I'm going to my field now, it is a different approach. It is not only what I can get out of this field, but it is also how the field will benefit from this interaction that we're having. So it is not the farmer and his field, kind of mentality where I will make this ground grow A, B, C, D. It is the ground and I will work together in this way.
And I really like that, because I just yesterday heard a really interesting story of a test plot that was done actually on Vancouver Island a number of years ago. This individual took over this timbered area, and they did an evaluation of how many board feet, and again, that's a terminology that is used in the lumber industry, to how much available wood was available. And I don't remember the number. Now, over the last 40 years, this individual has been slowly harvesting this wood out as it matures, over-mature, etc. on it, planting new ones. And today there's more board feet of available wood in that piece of property
yeah.
than he started with. And I think that's a perfect example of farming that was described in Genesis, where that man, the man getting involved, actually upped the value of that by his participation, and in the process, that land yielded a whole lot of resources for him.
That absolutely blows my mind, because the meta-narrative we've grown accustomed to is, I mean, even some of the farming techniques I grew up with were all about how do I take, give you time to recover while I take on the other side. And then when you need to recover, I'll come back here and take some more here.
I'm familiar with that.
But what you were pointing out here, Greg, is that how do we do this together? And so that at the end of the day, when we both walk away, we have both gone up a level, land and human being.
And that gets back to it's life positive, because there's more life in that field than that before that man got there.
Yeah.
There is more, everything has gone up. And again, the value of life is risen.
It is life positive. Here is that word again, life positive. I just like that. The something else that I think is quite important in the other two creation narratives, probably, well, maybe one of them, the Epic of Atrahasis. One thing I think is quite valuable in the story that maybe we don't pay attention to a lot is that there is that the gods are not completely decided on destroying people. There is, amongst the gods, there is still a valuing, there's still this life positivity that is there. And hence this god comes to Atrahasis and says, hey, buddy, something tragic is coming your way.
Yeah, heads up.
Heads up, yeah? You need to build an ark. And not only for you, but for the animals also. Here's that connection with the earth. And this, and I think that is valuable. The Genesis narrative talks about that also. God speaks to Noah and says, you do this and you save your family and your animals. And oftentimes that is lifted as it's a great narrative. I don't deny it as a great narrative, but that narrative is there also in this story. And why I value this narrative now, just give me a second to explain this. Why I value this narrative here, that's because there are so many people out there who identify as non-religious, and therefore the Genesis narrative is not a narrative they want to shape their...
Doesn't resonate with them.
Yeah, you know. and they look at all the suffering that's out there. There's that old song. That's probably back in the 90s, Mr. Director. From a distance, the world looks blue and green, and God is watching us from a distance. I want to remember who sang that piece. There's this mentality that the gods are watching at a distance and they're seeing all this mess happening, and they're like, oh my goodness, they're going to destroy themselves, and we feel like the gods are not in touch. There it is. There's the song from a distance, song by, oh my goodness, I'm going to mess her name, Bette Midler. A song by Bette Midler, and there's that line that God is watching us from a distance, and people get that sense sometimes that God is not involved in this. Just all hell is breaking loose. If God cared, He would do this. He would help me here. In the Epic of Atrahasis, when you feel like God is at a distance, know that that's not the full picture. There's a God who is willing to step in and say, hey, you can get through this. You can survive this. You can, here's the plan. You do this and this and this and this and this and this. Basically, back to that question, that statement you said, the universe is not against you.
That's right.
The universe is for you, even though it looks like it's against you. Because sometimes the universe does look like it's against you. I've had friends who have had to live through hurricanes, and we all know how messy those things can be, and great tragedies, war, and it is easy to feel like, to ask the question, where is God?
Exactly.
God is against me.
Yeah.
I've lost everything. Yeah. Where is God? I worked hard, I lost it all. In this narrative, and credit to the narrative, it's saying, hey, it looks that way, but there's hope.
The universe is still conspiring for your good.
The universe is still conspiring for your good. It's not a story of hopelessness. And why I like that story, because in the Genesis narrative, God is all out for your good. Okay, God is just all out for your good.
Yeah.
In this narrative, they're saying, well, bad things have happened. The gods look like they are conspiring against you. But look, that's not the entire picture. And I like that.
Yep. Yeah, you gotta love that.
Yeah, I like that, because it seems to me like it acknowledges the mess around me.
That's right.
But it also acknowledges that I am not stuck in this mess. There's a way out. I can live to fight another day.
Ah, yes, yeah.
So to on a play of words here, when things are messy and it looks like they are just like all hell is broken loose, well, everything is not black and white.
That's right.
There is something else in there.
Yeah.
And I think these stories, Greg, these stories are valuable. I
agree.
I think these stories are pretty valuable. I think these stories are, when one story, and I don't know, might disagree on this, when one story is not tackling the questions that are important in your life, open your soul and see what all the other stories are saying. Because ultimately, the stories are not anti-God.
That's true.
And the stories are bringing you to a place where you are valued to some extent. So like in my example of the Genesis narrative, where I'm like, okay, I don't think I want to treat my wife like the second Genesis narrative. Okay, I'm not going to embrace that. But I'm going to embrace that for me to be here, there's a a God behind the scenes who is making everything conspire for my good. I mean, that's where I stand on this. Where do you stand on these stories?
I think your point is a very valid one, and that each one of these stories bring us another angle, another perspective. And I occasionally have equipment that breaks down, and we have people come in to fix it, etc. Not one tool fixes everything.
Oh, yeah.
So we need a variety of different tools to get the job done. I do have my favorite tools, though.
Yeah.
And some of them work in a remarkably wide array of different things. So I do have my biases, I will admit. But the Genesis story is my bias. These other two stories have validity, and I appreciate your point you make. There's value that we can get from. So yeah, I'm with you there.
Yeah. And I guess because you and I can talk the entire day on this, I'm quite interested because Greg, we don't know it all. I mean, I think you and I are the first ones to admit this. I would like to find out. I would like to learn all the other creation narratives out there and what they mean to the people who are watching this.
Yes. Yeah.
So just please take time and just share your creation narrative. What narrative do you know, and what value does it bring to your life?
Yeah.
And while you're doing that, I'll also encourage you to just be a part of this movement where we are saying there is value in context and nuance and conversation. Context, nuance, conversation. And then just go on the website there, click that link for the website, and go and purchase yourself the Never Black and White t-shirt. You need to do that. But for now, I think, my friend, let's call it a day. Okay. And we will meet again to have more interesting
a lot more interesting
conversations.